In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, in what is now northeastern France, a woman named Frau Troffea walked into the street and began to dance. She had not been invited to dance. There was no music, there was no festival, there was no occasion. She simply danced, and she did not stop. For 4 to 6 days, Frau Troffea danced in the streets of Strasbourg. She danced through the day and into the night. She danced until her feet bled. She danced until she collapsed from exhaustion, slept briefly, and then rose and danced again. By the end of the first week, somewhere between 30 and 400 people, the historical sources disagree on the number, as historical sources often do, had joined her. By the end of August 1518, somewhere between 50 and 400 people had died. Not from violence, not from disease in the conventional sense. They died from exhaustion, from heart failure, from stroke, from dancing. This is not a legend. This is not a folk tale told to frighten children. This is a documented historical event recorded in physicians' notes, in city council minutes, in sermons, in chronicles written by people who were there and who were as baffled as we are. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of the strangest events in European history, and it is also, if you look at it carefully enough, one of the most human. Today, we're going to try to understand it. Not just what happened, though we'll go through that in considerable detail, but why. Why Strasbourg? Why 1518? Why dancing? And why the explanations that seem most obvious are probably wrong, while the explanation that seems most unsettling is probably right. Let's start where the story starts, with a city under enormous pressure and a woman who couldn't stop moving. Part 1. Strasbourg in 1518. To understand the dancing plague, you have to understand Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, because what happened there was not random. It did not fall from the sky. It grew from specific soil, in a specific place, at a specific moment in history, and that specificity matters. Strasbourg in 1518 was a prosperous city by the standards of its time. It sat on the Rhine, a major trading artery, and its position made it commercially significant and culturally connected to the wider world of Renaissance Europe. It had a population of somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people, which made it a substantial urban centre for the period. But 1518 was not a good year, and the years immediately preceding it had been worse. The Rhine region had been struck by a sequence of agricultural disasters throughout the early 16th century. Harvests had failed. Winters had been cruel. The food supply, which was always precarious in this period, had become genuinely inadequate. Famine was not a distant threat. It was a present reality for significant portions of the population, particularly the urban poor who could not grow their own food and who depended on the market for their survival. Alongside the famine came disease. Syphilis, which had arrived in Europe in the 1490s and was spreading with terrifying speed, was present in Strasbourg. Smallpox came and went. The sweating sickness, a mysterious and lethal illness that appeared in epidemics throughout this period, killing within hours, with a mortality rate that terrified contemporaries, had swept through the region. Leprosy, though declining, was still a visible reality. And then there was the religious anxiety. 1518 was 1 year after Martin Luther had posted his 95 Theses. The Reformation was not yet the Reformation. It was a theological dispute that had not yet fully broken into the open rupture that would follow. But the atmosphere in the German-speaking world was one of profound uncertainty about the Church, about salvation, about the right relationship between human beings and God. The authority of the Catholic Church, which had been the organizing framework for all of European life for 1,000 years, was under challenge in ways that were deeply destabilizing, even for people who couldn't articulate exactly what was happening. Strasbourg itself would become one of the early centers of Reformation thought within a decade. In 1518, it was a city in which traditional Catholic frameworks were being questioned but not yet replaced, leaving a population without the stable religious scaffolding that gives people a way to understand suffering. And there was so much suffering to understand. The theological question that haunted ordinary people in this period was not abstract. It was why? Why is God punishing us? What have we done? The framework of divine punishment was the primary explanatory model available to people in 1518 for understanding collective suffering. When crops failed and children died and disease swept through a city, the question was not what natural or social mechanism caused this. The question was, what sin had provoked God's wrath? This matters for what comes next, because the dancing plague emerged from a population that was hungry, sick, frightened, religiously anxious, and searching desperately for an explanation for their suffering and for a way out of it. Into this city, on a day in early July 1518, walked Frau Troffea. Part 2. Frau Troffea. We know almost nothing about Frau Troffea as an individual. Her first name is not recorded. Frau is simply the German honorific for a married woman. Troffea appears to be her husband's name, or a variant of it. She was almost certainly a woman of the urban poor or the lower middle class. Wealthy women did not typically appear in the street doing inexplicable things, and if they did, the historical record handled them differently. What we know is what she did. She walked into a street or square in Strasbourg. The specific location is not clearly recorded, and she began to dance. The contemporary accounts describe her as dancing involuntarily, compulsively, without apparent control over her own movements. She was not dancing in celebration. She was not dancing in religious ecstasy, in the manner of some established traditions of devotional movement. She was simply dancing, with a quality of desperation and exhaustion that onlookers found deeply disturbing rather than joyful. She danced through the day. She danced through the night. Her husband, whose name is also not reliably recorded, apparently attempted to stop her and could not. The city authorities became aware of her within the first day or two. By the end of the first week, she had been joined by others. The historical sources are inconsistent about the numbers, and this inconsistency is worth acknowledging directly rather than papering over. Some accounts suggest that within a week, 30 people had joined Frau Troffea. Others suggest the number reached 400 at the epidemic's peak. The city council documents, which are among the more reliable sources, suggest the outbreak was serious enough to require official response, which implies numbers large enough to constitute a public health crisis. What we can say with confidence is this: the dancing spread. People who witnessed Frau Troffea began dancing themselves. People who heard about the dancing came and began dancing. The epidemic grew in the way that epidemics grow, through contact, through transmission, through a mechanism that was invisible to those experiencing it and remains somewhat contested among those studying it 5 centuries later. The dancing itself was not joyful. This is critical. Every contemporary account emphasizes the same quality. The dancers did not appear to be enjoying themselves. They appeared to be suffering. Their faces showed anguish rather than pleasure. Many wept while dancing. Many called out. Some appeared to be in a state that contemporaries described as trance-like, not fully present, not responding normally to their environment. Their bodies told the story most clearly. Feet bled through shoes and continued to move. Legs gave out and dancers fell, were helped up and continued. People danced until they vomited, until they fainted, until they were caught in something that looked entirely beyond their ability to stop. And then some of them died. Part 3. The city responds. The Strasbourg City Council was confronted with something that had no precedent in their administrative experience. A significant and growing number of their citizens were dancing uncontrollably in the streets, some of them dying, and none of the conventional frameworks, medical, religious, legal, provided a clear path forward. Their first response was, by the standards of the time, medically reasonable. They consulted physicians. The physicians examined the dancers and reached a conclusion that will seem startling to modern ears, but made perfect sense within the medical framework of 1518. They determined that the dancing was caused by hot blood, the medical theory of the humours, the system derived from ancient Greek medicine that explained illness as an imbalance of 4 bodily fluids, attributed various conditions to excess heat in the blood. The frenzied, uncontrollable movement of the dancers was interpreted as a manifestation of this excess. The treatment, logically within this framework, was to allow the hot blood to work itself out through further movement. The city council therefore decided to encourage the dancing rather than suppress it. They cleared public spaces. They brought in musicians, drummers and pipers to provide accompaniment and structure to the dancing. They constructed a wooden stage to give the dancers a dedicated space. The logic within the humoral framework was that the hot blood needed to be expended through exertion. Once the excess was worked out, the condition would resolve. The analogy in modern medicine would be something like sweating out a fever. The idea that the body needs to discharge something, and that facilitating that discharge accelerates recovery. Instead, the dancing spread further. Within days or weeks of the city's decision to accommodate the dancers, the numbers had grown. The music, the stage, the professional supporters, rather than providing a structured environment for recovery, they had provided a structured environment for transmission. The epidemic was accelerating precisely because the treatment was feeding it. When this became clear, the city council reversed course. The musicians were dismissed. The stage was dismantled. The council issued edicts prohibiting dancing, not just the epidemic dancing, but all public dancing and some forms of music, under the assumption that normal dancing might trigger or worsen the condition in vulnerable people. The dancers were gathered up and transported in wagons to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. Part 4. Saint Vitus. The choice of Saint Vitus was not arbitrary. It was the product of a very specific intersection of folk belief, religious tradition, and the peculiar logic of medieval and early modern medicine. Saint Vitus was a Christian martyr of the 3rd century, a young man who was tortured and killed for his faith under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. He was associated, in the Catholic tradition, with epilepsy and nervous disorders, conditions that caused involuntary movement. His feast day, June 15th, had long been associated in German folklore with dancing, and with the idea that those who danced before his shrine on his feast day would enjoy good health for the following year. There was also a folk belief, documented in various forms across the German-speaking world, that those who offended Saint Vitus or who were cursed in his name would be afflicted with uncontrollable dancing. The connection between Saint Vitus and compulsive movement was therefore already present in the cultural imagination of Strasbourg's citizens before the epidemic began. The condition we now call Sydenham's chorea, a neurological disorder characterized by involuntary jerky movements of the limbs and face, typically following rheumatic fever, was historically called Saint Vitus's dance. This name existed before 1518 and persisted long after. The cultural association between the saint and involuntary movement was old and deeply rooted. The decision to send the dancers to St. Vitus's shrine at Saverne was therefore both a medical and a religious intervention. It was an acknowledgement that the condition was beyond the capacity of secular medicine to treat. The physicians had tried and made things worse, and a transfer of the problem to spiritual authority. At Saverne, the dancers were subjected to religious rituals. They wore red shoes, the colour associated with Saint Vitus in the regional tradition. They were anointed with holy oil. Masses were said for them. They prayed, or were prayed over. And gradually, over the course of the late summer of 1518, the dancing stopped. The epidemic ended. Not dramatically, not with a single moment of resolution. It simply wound down over weeks until the last dancers stopped and the streets of Strasbourg returned to whatever normal looked like after a summer of collective madness. No one could explain why it had started. No one could explain why it had stopped. Part 5. What people believed at the time, the people of Strasbourg in 1518 offered several explanations for what was happening to their city, and it is worth taking those explanations seriously before we discuss what modern scholars think actually occurred. The most widespread belief among ordinary people was supernatural. The dancing was the result of a curse, specifically a curse by St. Vitus himself, visited upon the city for some collective sin or some specific offence. This framework was not irrational within the worldview of 1518. Saints were understood to be active agents in the world, capable of intercession on behalf of their devotees and retribution against those who offended them. A city undergoing famine, disease, and economic hardship had clearly done something to deserve divine punishment. The dancing was the form that punishment was taking. A related belief attributed the dancing to demonic possession. The Church's framework for understanding involuntary behaviour, particularly behaviour of a dramatic and public nature, included the possibility that demons had entered a person's body and were controlling their movements. Exorcism, within this framework, was a potential treatment. The anguished quality of the dancers, their apparent lack of control, their suffering, all of these fit the template of possession as understood in popular religion. Some contemporaries suggested that the dancing was caused by a poisoning of some kind. The ergot hypothesis, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly, was not articulated in 1518 in its modern form, but the idea that something in the food or water might be causing the condition was not entirely absent from contemporary thinking. The physicians, as we've discussed, went with hot blood, the humoral explanation. This was the learned, educated, scientifically respectable explanation of the time, and it led directly to the worst possible intervention, providing music and space for the dancing to continue and spread. What is striking about all of these explanations, the supernatural curse, the demonic possession, the humoral excess, the poisoning, is that none of them placed responsibility on the dancers themselves. There is very little evidence in the contemporary record of the dancers being blamed for their condition, or of the dancing being interpreted as a choice. This is significant. It means that Strasbourg's response to the epidemic was fundamentally compassionate, even where it was medically wrong. The dancers were understood as afflicted, not as deviants. Part 6. What scholars have said since the dancing plague of 1518 has attracted serious scholarly attention for several centuries, and the explanations proposed have shifted dramatically as the cultural and scientific frameworks available to scholars have changed. The oldest and most persistent alternative explanation is ergotism. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that grows on rye and other grains, particularly in damp conditions. When humans consume grain contaminated with ergot, they can develop ergotism, which comes in two forms: convulsive ergotism, characterized by seizures, spasms, and hallucinations, and gangrenous ergotism, characterized by vasoconstriction that cuts off blood flow to the extremities. The ergot hypothesis for the dancing plague is superficially attractive. Rye was a staple grain in Alsace. The wet conditions that preceded the 1518 famine would have been favourable for ergot growth. The convulsive form of ergotism could theoretically produce seizure-like movements that might be mistaken for dancing. And ergotism was genuinely present in medieval and early modern Europe. The condition known as St. Anthony's fire was almost certainly convulsive ergotism. The hypothesis falls apart under examination, however, and most serious scholars who have looked at it carefully have rejected it. The primary problem is the nature of the movement. Ergot-related convulsions are not dancing. They are not coordinated rhythmic movements of the kind described in the 1518 accounts. They are chaotic, uncontrolled spasms. The contemporary descriptions of the 1518 dancers consistently emphasize the dancing quality of the movement. The fact that it resembled, however agonizingly, actual dancing. Ergotism does not produce dancing. It produces convulsions. The second problem is the mechanism of spread. Ergotism is a poisoning. It spreads through contaminated grain that multiple people eat. It does not spread through observation or contact. The 1518 epidemic clearly spread through something more like social transmission. People who encountered the dancers were more likely to begin dancing themselves. This is not how a poisoning works. The third problem is the social profile of the victims. Ergotism tends to affect those who eat the most contaminated grain, which in a famine situation would tend to be the very poor, eating the worst quality food. The 1518 dancers appear to have come from a broader social range than you would expect from a poisoning, and the epidemic's epicenter in public space rather than private households is inconsistent with a dietary cause. So if not ergotism, then what? Part 7. The psychogenic explanation. The explanation that currently commands the most scholarly support was developed most fully by the historian John Waller, whose 2008 book, A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, remains the most comprehensive account of the 1518 epidemic. And it is, on first hearing, an explanation that many people resist, because it requires us to take seriously something that our culture tends to dismiss. The dancing plague was a psychogenic illness. A mass psychogenic illness, to be precise. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, though that term carries misleading connotations. is a well-documented phenomenon in which symptoms of illness spread through a group of people through psychological rather than biological mechanisms. The symptoms are real, the suffering is real. The physical manifestations, the movements, the pain, the exhaustion, the deaths are real. But the cause is not a pathogen, not a toxin, not a structural neurological condition. It is the mind generating physical symptoms, and that generation spreading from person to person through a mechanism that involves observation, suggestion, shared cultural frameworks, and shared stress. This sounds, in the contemporary ear, like saying the dancers were faking it. They were not faking it. This is the crucial distinction that makes mass psychogenic illness difficult to communicate clearly. The human nervous system is capable of generating real physical symptoms, pain, paralysis, movement, sensory disturbance, through psychological mechanisms. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented neurological reality. The condition we now call functional neurological disorder describes exactly this: real neurological symptoms verified by medical examination that are generated by the nervous system's response to psychological stress rather than by structural damage or disease. And critically, these symptoms can spread, not through any physical mechanism, but through the same channels by which human beings transmit any information to each other: observation, shared experience, cultural expectation. When a community shares a framework that makes a particular set of symptoms legible, that says, in effect, this is what affliction looks like in our world, individuals under sufficient stress may begin to express that affliction in exactly those terms. In 1518, Strasbourg, the framework was Saint Vitus, the folk tradition that connected Saint Vitus with dancing, with involuntary movement, with divine punishment for collective sin, provided the template. Frau Troffea, whoever she was, whatever particular intersection of stress and psychology produced her initial episode, expressed her distress in the culturally available form, and in a community that was simultaneously stressed beyond its capacity to cope and saturated with cultural knowledge of St. Vitus's dance, the template spread. Part 8. The mechanism of spread. The mechanism by which mass psychogenic illness spreads is better understood now than it has ever been, partly because we have modern cases to study. Mass psychogenic illness has not gone away. It is documented throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. In 1962, in a Tanganyika boarding school, an outbreak of laughter, uncontrollable, anguished, not funny, spread through hundreds of schoolgirls and eventually closed the school. In 2011, in Leroy, New York, a cluster of teenage girls developed tics and involuntary movements that spread through the school community and attracted national media attention before being identified as mass psychogenic illness. In 2019, dancers in Mexico began experiencing similar episodes. In every documented case, the pattern is consistent. The illness begins with an individual or small group under significant stress. It spreads to others who are in close contact, physically, socially, emotionally. It spreads most readily within communities that share a common stressor, a common cultural framework for understanding illness, and strong social bonds between members. It is amplified by attention, media coverage, public discussion, the presence of authority figures who treat the illness as serious, and diminished by separation of affected individuals from each other and from the social context that is maintaining it. This pattern maps onto 1518 Strasbourg with uncomfortable precision. The individual beginning, Frau Troffea, under whatever personal stress produced her episode, in a city under collective stress. The community stressor, famine, disease, religious anxiety, the accumulated misery of years of hardship. The shared cultural framework, St. Vitus's dance, the folk tradition of dancing affliction, the known template for what divine punishment looked like. The amplification, the city council's decision to provide musicians, a stage, and professional supporters, which gathered the dancers together, gave them an audience, legitimized the dancing as a recognized condition requiring public management, and created exactly the social context most favorable to further spread. The resolution, the removal of the dancers from Strasbourg, their physical separation from the community, the religious intervention at Saverne, the dismantling of the stage and dismissal of the musicians, all of which broke the social conditions maintaining the epidemic. The dancing plague ended when Strasbourg stopped treating it as a spectacle. Conclusion. Frau Troffea danced in the streets of Strasbourg for 4 to 6 days before anyone understood that something unprecedented was happening. By the time the summer was over, dozens of people had died dancing in a city that did not know how to stop them. We still don't fully understand what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. The historical record is incomplete. The sources disagree. The mechanisms of mass psychogenic illness, while better understood than they were even 50 years ago, remain incompletely mapped. There are aspects of the story that no explanation currently accounts for fully, but we understand enough to say this with confidence. The dancing plague was not supernatural, was not a mass poisoning, was not a collective choice, and was not madness in any simple sense. The people who danced did not want to dance. The people who died did not choose to die. They were caught in something, a confluence of hunger and fear and cultural tradition and social contagion that was beyond any individual's capacity to resist or escape. And 500 years later, we are not so different from them as we like to think. We are not immune to collective psychological breakdown. We are not beyond the reach of mass psychogenic phenomena. They continue to occur in schools and factories and online communities, wherever groups of people share sufficient stress and sufficient cultural context. The mechanisms that produced the dancing plague of 1518 are still operating. They operate in us. They always will. The distance between Strasbourg in July 1518 and the present moment is 5 centuries of history, and essentially no distance at all in terms of human psychology. We are the same frightened, social, suggestible, resilient, fragile creatures that danced in the summer heat until some of them fell and did not rise again. Understanding that, really understanding it, seems like the least we can do for them. In memory of those who danced in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, their names mostly are not recorded. Their story is. If you've watched this far, let me know where you're watching this story from. Consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. See you soon.